September 11th, 1944. The Belgian-German frontier near Aachen. Oberst Günther von Schwerin stood in the concrete observation bunker of the Westwall, known to Allied forces as the Siegfried Line, and watched through his field glasses as American supply columns moved with mechanical precision toward his positions. The defensive belt stretching before him represented 4 years of construction, 18,000 bunkers and pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles extending for 390 miles from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. This was the shield that would halt the American advance, allow time for regrouping, perhaps even turn the tide in the west. Yet, as von Schwerin observed the endless procession of trucks below, a cold certainty settled over him. The Siegfried Line would not hold. Not because its fortifications were inadequate, but because the Americans possessed something far more devastating than any weapon, a logistics system that could deliver 12,000 tons of supplies daily to armies that never paused, never faltered, never ran out of anything. The story of how American logistics shattered Germany's last major defensive line in the West is not primarily about combat operations or tactical brilliance. It is about the collision between two fundamentally different concepts of warfare. The Germans had built their defense on the assumption that distance and fortification would exhaust American supply lines, that modern armies required pauses to consolidate logistics, that industrial production meant nothing if supplies could not reach the front. The Americans were about to demonstrate that every one of these assumptions was catastrophically wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the Siegfried Line fell with such unexpected speed, we must first understand what it was designed to prevent. The Westwall's construction began in 1938 as the Third Reich prepared for the possibility of war with France. By 1939, over 500,000 German workers had transformed the western frontier into the most extensive fortification system built since World War I. The defensive belt consisted of multiple lines, in some areas extending over 30 miles in depth. Each bunker was positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, with anti-tank obstacles nicknamed Dragon's Teeth creating barriers that American Shermans could not simply drive through. The bunkers themselves were constructed of reinforced concrete up to 3 meters thick, sufficient to withstand direct hits from anything except the largest Allied artillery. Garrison troops manning these positions in autumn 1944 believed themselves secure behind walls that artillery could not breach and armor could not bypass. German military planning in September 1944 assumed that Allied supply lines had reached their breaking point. The pursuit across France had carried American armies nearly 400 miles from the Normandy beaches in less than 90 days. Traditional military doctrine held that such advances inevitably created logistical collapse. Every German staff officer had studied Napoleon's advance to Moscow, the elongation of supply lines that ultimately doomed the Grand Army regardless of tactical victories. They had experienced themselves on the Eastern Front, how rapid advances created vulnerable salients that could be cut off and destroyed when supply lines failed. The assumption that the Americans must pause to reorganize their logistics was not wishful thinking, but established military principle, confirmed by centuries of European warfare. What German intelligence failed to grasp in September 1944 was that American logistics operated on entirely different principles than anything in European military experience. The American supply system was not an adaptation of traditional methods, but an entirely new approach based on industrial mass production and corporate management techniques. The numbers involved defied German comprehension. By September 1, 1944, Allied forces in Europe numbered 2 million men organized in 42 divisions. Daily supply requirements for this force exceeded 26,000 tons, including 800,000 gallons of gasoline alone. The distance from the Normandy beaches to forward positions near the German border now exceeded 450 miles. Traditional military mathematics indicated such supply requirements over such distances were impossible to sustain. The American solution to this logistics challenge was the creation of an integrated supply system operating at scales no military force had previously attempted. The Red Ball Express, established August 25th, had demonstrated that dedicated motor transport could move supplies at rates exceeding anything railways could provide. But the express was merely one component of a larger system. By early September, the communications zone, the logistics command supporting combat operations, operated 240,000 vehicles in France. This fleet represented more motor transport than the entire German army possessed on all fronts combined. American supply dumps near Paris held 97,000 tons of supplies by September 1st. Additional dumps were being established every 50 miles along the axis of advance. The logistics system was not simply moving supplies forward, but creating a progressive infrastructure of supply points that eliminated the traditional vulnerability of extended supply lines. The material foundation of American logistics supremacy was standardization on a scale that European manufacturing had never achieved. Consider the ubiquitous GMC CCKW truck, the 2.5-ton vehicle that formed the backbone of American motor transport. General Motors produced 562,000 of these trucks between 1941 and 1945. Every one was identical. Every one used the same parts. Every one could be maintained by any mechanic trained on the standardized vehicle. This contrasted dramatically with German logistics, which employed over 150 different truck models, each requiring unique spare parts and specialized maintenance. An American unit experiencing vehicle breakdown could cannibalize parts from any other truck in the fleet. A German unit with a broken truck often had to wait for specific parts that might never arrive because the manufacturer had ceased production or been destroyed by Allied bombing. The human organization behind American logistics was equally revolutionary. The Transportation Corps had expanded from 7,000 officers and men in December 1941 to over 400,000 by September 1944. This massive expansion required not just recruiting personnel, but developing entirely new training programs, maintenance procedures, and operational doctrines. Truck companies were organized like corporate entities, with systematic maintenance schedules, standardized loading procedures, and continuous operational tempo. Drivers worked in two-man teams, allowing vehicles to remain in continuous operation. Maintenance battalions positioned every 50 miles could service vehicles without removing them from operational cycles for extended periods. The statistics of American logistics in early September 1944 represented a revolution in military capability. Daily truck traffic along major supply routes exceeded 6,000 vehicles. The average turnaround time for a truck traveling from Normandy to forward positions and back had been reduced to 3 days through systematic traffic control and dedicated highways. Fuel consumption of the American armies in France exceeded 800,000 gallons daily, yet reserve stocks at supply dumps were actually increasing. American artillery units were expending ammunition at rates 10 times higher than German units, yet shortages were temporary and local, resolved within hours. This was not traditional military logistics. This was American industrial capacity projected directly onto the battlefield through systematic organization that treated supply as a production process rather than a traditional military function. German intelligence gathering about American logistics in September 1944 was extensive but fundamentally misunderstood what was being observed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over American supply routes photographed truck columns extending for dozens of miles. Intelligence officers calculated tonnage being moved and concluded the figures must represent temporary surge capacity that could not be sustained. When captured, American supply documents revealed that daily deliveries were actually increasing rather than declining despite the extended distances. German staff officers initially dismissed these documents as deception. The possibility that Americans could sustain such supply rates indefinitely contradicted everything European military experience taught about logistics. The assumption that American abundance must eventually exhaust itself was not stupidity but reasonable extrapolation from historical precedent. What German planners failed to recognize was that American industrial capacity operated on a scale that had no historical precedent. The Siegfried Line in September 1944 was manned by a patchwork of units representing the depleted state of German military power in the West. Divisions shattered during the Normandy campaign, and the retreat across France had been reformed with undertrained replacements, elderly reservists recalled to service, and even stomach ulcer battalions, composed of men whose digestive problems supposedly made them suitable only for static defence. The 48th Infantry Division defending the approaches to Aachen numbered only 5,000 men, less than half its authorised strength. Artillery units possessed adequate guns but limited ammunition, with fire restricted to defensive emergencies. Armour support was virtually non-existent. The few German tanks available in the West were being husbanded for counterattacks, leaving infantry to face American armour with nothing but anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust rockets. Yet German commanders still placed faith in the defensive power of fortifications. The Westwall's construction had consumed enormous resources, representing one of the Third Reich's largest construction projects. The bunkers had been designed to withstand the heaviest artillery bombardment. The anti-tank obstacles created killing zones where American armour would be forced to halt under fire. The multiple defensive lines meant that even if outer positions fell, successive lines would channel attackers into prepared killing grounds. German doctrine emphasized that defensive warfare behind fortifications multiplied the combat power of limited forces. Historical precedent supported this doctrine. The Maginot Line's northern terminus had held German forces to minimal gains in 1940, despite overwhelming offensive superiority. Static defences at Cassino had halted Allied advances in Italy for months, despite complete Allied air superiority and material abundance. There was reason to believe the Siegfried Line could impose similar delays on American forces, buying time for Germany to organize new armies and perhaps negotiate favorable peace terms. What German planners failed to account for was how American logistics eliminated the traditional advantages of fortified defense. In conventional warfare, attacking fortified positions required accumulating massive ammunition stocks, positioning artillery within range, and accepting extended preparation times that allowed defenders to reinforce threatened sectors. American logistics eliminated these constraints. Artillery battalions supporting American attacks fired without regard to ammunition consumption because supply trucks delivered shells faster than guns could fire them. Fuel. Abundance allowed American armor to maneuver constantly, probing for weak points without concern that extended operations would exhaust supplies. Air superiority, sustained by continuous supply of aviation fuel and ordnance, meant German reinforcements attempting to reach threatened positions faced constant harassment long before reaching the front lines. The first American probes against the Siegfried Line began September 11, 1944, when reconnaissance elements of the 3rd Armoured Division reached positions near Rottgen, just inside the German border. The initial skirmishes revealed that German defenders, while determined, lacked the heavy weapons and abundant ammunition that might have made the fortifications truly formidable. American patrols reported that German artillery fire, while accurate, was limited, with batteries firing only a few rounds before falling silent, apparently conserving scarce ammunition. German infantry fought skillfully from prepared positions, but withdrew when faced with concentrated American artillery and armor, unable to sustain prolonged defense without support. These initial engagements suggested that the Siegfried Line's effectiveness depended on factors that no longer existed: plentiful artillery ammunition, mobile reserves to counterattack penetrations, and the assumption that attackers would be constrained by their own supply limitations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The actual assault on the Siegfried Line began September 14th, with operations by 7 Corps, commanded by Major General J. Lawton Collins. The attack plan reflected confidence born of logistics superiority. Rather than methodically reducing each fortification, American forces would punch through the defensive belt at multiple points simultaneously, relying on material superiority to overwhelm defenders before they could effectively respond. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of Omaha Beach and the Normandy campaign, spearheaded the assault near Aachen. Supporting them was an artillery concentration that represented everything German defenders feared about American material abundance. 12 artillery battalions, 144 guns ranging from 105mm howitzers to 155mm long toms, were positioned to support the initial assault. These guns possessed sufficient ammunition for sustained bombardment, measured in days rather than hours. Additional ammunition was already moving forward from supply dumps, ensuring that fire support would never be interrupted by shortages. The preliminary bombardment that preceded the assault provided German defenders their first direct experience with the implications of American logistics supremacy. For 6 hours on September 14th, American artillery maintained continuous fire on German positions. Batteries fired without interruption, their guns growing so hot that crews poured water on barrels to prevent damage, yet ammunition supply never faltered. German defenders, huddled in concrete bunkers, experienced bombardment that exceeded anything they had endured in previous campaigns. For comparison, German artillery units during defensive operations typically budgeted 50 rounds per gun per day. American guns were firing 300 rounds daily, sustained indefinitely. The psychological impact of this material disparity was devastating. German soldiers understood that no amount of training or courage could counter enemies who possessed unlimited ammunition and the willingness to expend it without restraint. When American infantry advanced following the bombardment, they discovered that concrete fortifications that might have withstood artillery in previous wars could not survive the concentrated application of American firepower. Bunkers that remained intact after conventional artillery were engaged by tank destroyers firing at point-blank range, by combat engineers, with demolition charges, and ultimately by specialized armor equipped with dozer blades that simply buried positions under rubble. The multi-layered defense that German engineers had designed was penetrated in less than 48 hours, not because American tactics were revolutionary, but because American logistics allowed the sustained application of overwhelming force at every point simultaneously. German defenders fought skillfully, but found themselves consistently outgunned, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed by enemies who never paused, never ran out of ammunition, and advanced with mechanical inevitability. The penetration of the outer Siegfried Line positions created a crisis for German command. Traditional defensive doctrine required moving reserves to threatened sectors to contain breaches and organize counterattacks, but German reserves in the West in September 1944 were virtually non-existent. The few mobile formations available lacked fuel for extended operations. Panzer brigades earmarked for counterattacks found themselves immobilized by gasoline shortages, even before reaching combat. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, ordered to counterattack American penetrations near Roetgen, advanced 8 miles before halting with empty fuel tanks, within sight of their objectives but unable to continue operations. Without mobile reserves, without fuel to move forces that did exist, without ammunition stocks sufficient to sustain defensive fire, the Siegfried Line's inner positions could not be held regardless of their fortification quality. The logistical contrast between German and American forces during the Siegfried Line battles was stark and decisive. A German infantry division defending a 10-mile front received perhaps 200 tons of supplies daily, much of it delivered by horse-drawn wagons that required fodder, consuming a significant portion of payload capacity. An American division attacking the same front consumed 750 tons daily, all delivered by motor transport operating on dedicated supply routes, immune to the delays that plagued German logistics. German artillery units rationed ammunition, firing only at verified targets and then only with minimal expenditure. American artillery fired preparatory bombardments, maintained harassing fire throughout the day, and responded to any German activity with immediate concentrations. The mathematics of this disparity dictated outcomes regardless of tactical skill or defensive preparation. By September 20th, major penetrations of the Siegfried Line had been achieved along multiple axes. American forces had breached the defensive belt near Roetgen, penetrated positions south of Aachen, and were threatening to envelop the city from north and south. German commanders understood that the defensive line their nation had spent years constructing was failing not through any flaw in design, but through the simple reality that fortifications meant nothing when defenders lacked the supplies to sustain prolonged defense. The lesson was harsh but undeniable. Modern warfare had become an industrial process where production capacity and logistics efficiency mattered more than battlefield geography or engineering sophistication. The battle for Aachen itself, which would continue into October, demonstrated how American logistics transformed urban warfare from a defender's advantage into an attacker's certainty. German forces defending Aachen possessed every advantage traditional military wisdom attributed to urban defense. Buildings provided cover and observation. Rubble created obstacles for armor. The civilian population, though evacuated, left behind infrastructure that defenders knew intimately. Yet American logistics negated these advantages. Combat engineers brought forward bridging equipment, allowing armor to bypass rubble-choked streets. Artillery delivered smoke rounds, blocking German observation. Most critically, American units fighting in Aachen never experienced supply shortages. Ammunition was abundant. Fuel was unlimited. Even minor items like replacement boots, rations, and medical supplies reached frontline units without delay. German defenders fought with diminishing resources, each day seeing ammunition stocks decline, food become scarce, and medical supplies exhaust. The outcome was determined not by tactical considerations, but by which side could sustain operations indefinitely. The fall of Aachen on October 21, 1944, represented more than the capture of a single city. It marked the definitive breach of the Siegfried Line and confirmed that Germany's last defensive barrier in the West could not halt American advances supported by superior logistics. The city's capture cost American forces approximately 5,000 casualties, while German losses exceeded 12,000, with an additional 5,000 captured. These casualty figures reflected not just tactical outcomes, but the fundamental reality that defenders without adequate supplies eventually must surrender, regardless of fortification quality or fighting spirit. What made the rapid breach of the Siegfried Line particularly significant was what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare. For centuries, European military theory had emphasized the defensive power of fortifications. From medieval castles to World War I trench systems, properly constructed and adequately manned fortifications could halt attacks by much larger forces. The assumption was that attackers required material superiority of at least 3-1 to overcome prepared defenses, and even then, success required time, careful preparation, and acceptance of heavy casualties. The American penetration of the Siegfried Line demonstrated that these traditional calculations no longer applied when one side possessed overwhelming logistics superiority. American forces had not required 3-1 numerical advantage. They had not required extended preparation time. They had not accepted disproportionate casualties. They had simply maintained continuous pressure, supplied by logistics that could sustain any level of material expenditure indefinitely, and the fortifications had fallen with shocking rapidity. German military analysis of the Siegfried Line's failure focused increasingly on logistics rather than tactics. After-action reports from surviving units emphasized not American tactical skill but material abundance. German soldiers reported being overwhelmed not by superior tactics, but by artillery fire that never ceased, by armor that maneuvered constantly without apparent fuel concerns, by infantry that attacked repeatedly because casualties were immediately replaced and ammunition never ran out. Oberst von Schwerin, whose observation opened this narrative, was captured in late September and provided extensive commentary during interrogation. His assessment was blunt. "We built fortifications to stop armies. The Americans brought not an army but an industrial system. Concrete stops bullets and shells, but it cannot stop the overwhelming application of unlimited resources. We were defending against soldiers. They attacked with supply systems." The broader strategic implications of the Siegfried Line's rapid fall extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Germany's war planning in autumn 1944 had presumed that the Westwall would impose sufficient delay on American advances to allow time for organizing new defensive lines further east, for re-equipping shattered divisions, possibly even for negotiating a favorable settlement. The rapid American penetration eliminated this strategic breathing space. By late October, American forces were approaching the Ruhr River, threatening to break into the North German plain where traditional defensive positions would be even more difficult to establish and hold. The psychological impact on German military leadership was profound. If the Siegfried Line, years in construction and representing one of history's most extensive fortification systems, could be breached in weeks, what defensive position could possibly halt American advances? The answer, obvious to German commanders by November 1944, was that no defensive position could halt American advances so long as American logistics could sustain offensive operations indefinitely. The problem was not tactical. German soldiers, even undertrained replacements and overage reservists, fought skillfully and bravely. The problem was not operational. German commanders understood defensive warfare and positioned forces as effectively as limited resources permitted. The problem was strategic and industrial. Germany could not match American production capacity, could not replicate American logistics efficiency, and therefore could not sustain defensive operations against enemies who possessed unlimited material resources and the organizational capacity to deliver those resources to the point of battle continuously. The weeks following the initial penetration of the Siegfried Line in mid-September revealed a pattern that would characterize the final months of the war in Western Europe. American forces advanced not through tactical genius or operational brilliance, but through the relentless application of material superiority sustained by logistics that never failed. German commanders, recognizing they could not match American supply capabilities, attempted to adapt their defensive strategy to minimize American advantages. The results demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, no amount of tactical skill could compensate for fundamental logistics inferiority. The German response to the Siegfried Line's breach involved attempting to establish successive defensive positions using terrain features that might slow American advances, even without extensive fortifications. The Ruhr River, the Rhine River beyond it, and various intermediate positions offered natural obstacles that traditional military wisdom suggested could be defended effectively with limited forces. The strategy presumed that American logistics would eventually reach limits, that supply lines would become overextended, that the rapid advances characterizing September and October would necessarily pause to allow consolidation. This presumption was based on historical experience, spanning centuries of European warfare. No army in history had sustained rapid offensive operations indefinitely. Supply lines eventually became vulnerable, ammunition stocks eventually exhausted, mechanical breakdowns eventually accumulated faster than repair capacity could address them. The Germans were wagering that the laws of logistics that had governed warfare throughout history still applied. What German planners failed to recognize was that American logistics had fundamentally altered these historical constraints. The Transportation Corps, by November 1944, operated 282,000 vehicles in the European theatre. This fleet moved an average of 800,000 tons of supplies monthly to forward units. The scale of this operation exceeded anything in previous military history. For comparison, the entire German Wehrmacht on all fronts combined possessed fewer motor vehicles than the American logistics system in Western Europe alone. The standardization of American vehicles meant that mechanical breakdowns, rather than accumulating into operational crisis, were resolved quickly. Maintenance battalions positioned throughout the supply system could service any American truck because all trucks were identical. Parts inventory requirements were simplified. Mechanic training was standardized. The industrial logic that had created interchangeable parts for civilian manufacturing was applied to military logistics with devastating effectiveness. The human organization supporting American logistics in autumn 1944 represented an achievement as significant as any battlefield victory. The communications zone, responsible for all logistics in the European theatre, employed over 450,000 personnel by November. This force included not just truck drivers and mechanics, but traffic control specialists, supply depot managers, railway engineers, rebuilding French and Belgian rail networks, port battalions operating captured facilities at Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Antwerp, and civil affairs units managing relationships with liberated populations. The coordination required to move 800,000 tons monthly over distances exceeding 500 miles through a patchwork of rail lines, highways, and captured enemy infrastructure would have been impossible without systematic organization learned from American corporate management. Military officers applied techniques developed by American businesses for managing complex logistics, including inventory tracking systems, standardized loading procedures, and continuous improvement methodologies that would later be recognized as early forms of what corporate America would call supply chain management. The statistics of American logistics in late 1944 reveal the scale of the achievement. Daily fuel consumption of Allied forces in Europe exceeded 1 million gallons by November. Artillery ammunition expenditure averaged 8 million rounds monthly. Ration requirements exceeded 3 million individual meals daily. Medical supplies, spare parts, replacement vehicles, winter clothing, construction materials for forward airfields, and countless other items moved continuously from ports and supply dumps to forward units. The logistics system delivered all of this while simultaneously supporting the largest amphibious operation in history, the invasion of southern France in August, and preparing for future operations, including the eventual crossing of the Rhine. This was not merely impressive logistics. This was the transformation of supply from a supporting function to the decisive element of military power. German intelligence gathering about American logistics became increasingly sophisticated in autumn 1944, but understanding what was observed did not provide solutions for countering it. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, though increasingly limited by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, photographed American supply dumps and truck parks. The images revealed stockpiles that exceeded anything in German experience. A typical American supply dump photographed near Liège in November contained an estimated 50,000 tons of materiel, more than the entire German Army Group B possessed in reserve. Traffic analysis by German signals intelligence identified the volume of radio communications involved in coordinating American supply movements, and concluded the scale of organization exceeded anything German staffs had imagined possible. Interrogation of captured American soldiers provided details about supply procedures that German officers initially dismissed as exaggeration or deception. The reality that American units received fresh bread daily, that soldiers discarded equipment with minor defects rather than repairing it, that vehicles were replaced rather than extensively repaired, seemed to violate every principle of military economy German officers had been taught. The contrast in logistics philosophy between German and American forces went beyond mere scale to represent fundamentally different approaches to warfare. German military culture, shaped by centuries of resource scarcity, emphasized making do with limited means. Soldiers were trained to maintain equipment meticulously, to conserve ammunition, to view logistics as a constraint requiring constant management. American military culture, shaped by industrial abundance, treated logistics not as a constraint but as a weapon. Artillery commanders were encouraged to fire liberally because abundant supply eliminated the traditional requirement for ammunition conservation. Tank commanders maneuvered aggressively because fuel abundance removed the traditional vulnerability of armored units to supply disruption. Infantry officers requested air supply drops for minor items because the logistics system could deliver anything anywhere without jeopardizing major operations. This psychological difference, rooted in divergent national experiences of resource availability, proved as significant as any material disparity. The German Army's logistics system in late 1944 was collapsing under pressures that American abundance only exacerbated. Allied bombing had destroyed much of Germany's rail network, forcing increased reliance on motor transport precisely when fuel shortages were becoming critical. The Wehrmacht's continued use of horse-drawn transport, necessitated by insufficient motor vehicle production, created cascading logistics failures. Horses required fodder, consuming cargo capacity that might otherwise carry ammunition or fuel. Horses moved slowly, creating bottlenecks in supply distribution. Horses were vulnerable to weather. with autumn rains in 1944 turning unpaved roads into impassable mud that halted horse-drawn wagons while American trucks continued operating. Germany employed approximately 2.7 million horses during World War II, but by autumn 1944, these animals represented not military assets, but logistics liabilities. Every ton of fodder transported to feed horses was a ton unavailable for fuel or ammunition. Every unit delayed awaiting horse-drawn supplies was a unit unable to respond to rapidly changing tactical situations. The Battle of the Bulge, launched December 16, 1944, represented Germany's last major offensive in the West and provided the final demonstration of how logistics determined operational outcomes, regardless of tactical skill or initial success. German planners designed the offensive to exploit American logistical assumptions, striking through the Ardennes, where poor roads and difficult terrain would supposedly limit American supply capabilities. The plan presumed that rapid initial advances could capture American supply dumps, providing fuel for continued operations while simultaneously disrupting American logistics. Initial tactical success suggested these assumptions might be valid. German forces achieved complete surprise, penetrated 50 miles into American lines, and overran several supply installations. Yet within 72 hours, the logistics differential that had characterized the entire Western campaign reasserted itself with decisive effect. German spearhead units, advancing faster than their supply columns could follow, began running out of fuel. The Kampfgruppe paper, the most successful German penetration, advanced 60 miles before grinding to a halt with empty fuel tanks on December 19th. The column abandoned dozens of operational tanks and vehicles simply because no fuel could reach them. German artillery units, supporting the offensive, exhausted ammunition stocks within 3 days and received minimal resupply because horse-drawn supply columns could not navigate icy Belgian roads at speeds necessary to sustain offensive tempo. Meanwhile, American logistics responded to the crisis with speed that stabilized defensive positions almost immediately. Despite losing some supply dumps to the German advance, American forces re-established supply lines within 48 hours. Artillery units defending key positions like Bastogne fired without restriction, expending ammunition at rates that would have exhausted German stocks within hours. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled at Bastogne, received air supply drops that delivered more tonnage in a week than entire German divisions possessed in reserve. The contrast in logistics performance during the Bulge proved more decisive than any tactical consideration. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, later wrote that German forces were defeated not by American resistance, but by their own logistics, failures. His account, recorded during post-war interrogation, was blunt. "We planned to reach the Meuse River in 4 days, capture American supply dumps, and use captured fuel to continue to Antwerp. We reached maximum penetration in 5 days, captured minimal supplies, and halted through fuel exhaustion before American resistance became organized. Their logistics system, despite our disruption, continued functioning. Ours collapsed completely. We began the offensive with 4 days of fuel supply. They defended with unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, and the capacity to replace losses faster than we could inflict them. We were attempting 19th century warfare against a 20th century logistics system. The outcome was inevitable once our initial momentum failed." The failure of the Bulge offensive eliminated Germany's last strategic reserve and confirmed that American logistics could respond to any disruption faster than German forces could exploit it. The offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties, over 800 tanks and assault guns, and immeasurable quantities of fuel and ammunition that could not be replaced. American losses were comparable in personnel but were replaced within weeks. Equipment losses were replaced within days. Most significantly, American logistics had demonstrated the capacity to shift supply priorities, redirect traffic, and re-establish supply lines in the midst of the largest German offensive of the war, without ever truly faltering. This resilience, more than any battlefield consideration, convinced remaining German commanders that continued resistance was militarily futile. The final advance to the Rhine River in early 1945 demonstrated how completely American logistics had eliminated traditional constraints on offensive operations. Attacks launched in February and March advanced rapidly, not because German resistance weakened, though it had, but because American logistics could sustain simultaneous offensives across a 400-mile front. First Army advanced through the Ruhr River Valley, Third Army drove through the Palatinate, Seventh Army cleared the Saar region. Each offensive consumed supplies at rates that individually would have strained traditional logistics systems. Combined, they required delivery of over 15,000 tons daily. The American logistics system not only met these requirements but exceeded them, building reserve stocks even as operations intensified. The crossing of the Rhine at Remagen on March 7, 1945, when American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, illustrated how American logistics could exploit unexpected opportunities faster than German forces could respond to threats. Within 24 hours of the bridge's capture, American engineers had established ferry sites and begun constructing additional bridges. Within 48 hours, supply trucks were crossing the Rhine, establishing forward supply dumps on the eastern bank. Within 72 hours, 5 American divisions had crossed, supported by logistics that delivered everything from tank ammunition to bridge-building materials faster than German commanders could organize counterattacks. General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West, later stated that the Remagen crossing demonstrated American logistics had achieved a capability that traditional military thinking considered impossible: the capacity to sustain major operations across a major river obstacle without extended preparation or vulnerability to supply disruption. The final weeks of the war in Europe saw American forces advancing at speeds that exceeded even the pursuit across France in summer 1944. Seventh Army advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks during April. Third Army reached Czechoslovakia. First Army met Soviet forces at the Elbe River on April 25. These advances occurred despite German resistance that remained determined in many sectors. The difference was that German forces, lacking fuel, ammunition, and hope, could not sustain defense. American forces, supplied without restriction, could maintain offensive momentum indefinitely. The logistics differential that had characterized the campaign since Normandy reached its logical conclusion. Armies that could sustain operations indefinitely defeated armies that could not, regardless of tactical skill or defensive preparation. The final German surrender on May 8, 1945, ended a conflict in which American logistics had proven as decisive as any battlefield victory. The statistics of American logistics achievement in the European theatre between June 1944 and May 1945 were staggering. Over 7 million tons of supplies had been delivered to forward units. American forces had transported enough fuel to sustain 85 divisions in continuous operations across distances exceeding 600 miles. Artillery ammunition expenditure exceeded 60 million rounds. The Transportation Corps alone had driven over 300 million miles. This logistics effort had sustained the largest amphibious invasion in history, supported the fastest sustained advance in modern military operations, overcome setbacks during the Bulge, and delivered Allied armies to the Elbe River ahead of schedule. The broader lesson of American logistics in World War II extended far beyond operational success to fundamental questions about the nature of modern warfare. For centuries, military theorists had emphasized tactics, strategy, and operational art as the decisive elements of military power. The American logistics system demonstrated that in industrial warfare, supply capacity and organizational efficiency mattered more than traditional military virtues. The Wehrmacht, despite tactical proficiency and operational skill that often exceeded American capabilities, was defeated primarily through logistics inferiority. German soldiers fought bravely. German commanders planned skillfully. But German industry could not match American production. German organization could not replicate American systematic efficiency. German logistics could not sustain operations against enemies who possessed unlimited material resources and the organizational capacity to deliver those resources continuously. The testimony of German officers captured during the war's final months consistently emphasized logistics as the decisive factor in their defeat. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, stated during surrender negotiations that Germany had been defeated not by superior strategy but by superior supply. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, when asked what single factor most contributed to German defeat in the West, replied, "Everything else we might have countered through tactical adjustment or operational response. Their logistics capacity exceeded anything we could counter militarily." General Franz Halder, a former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in post-war analysis that the American logistics system represented a form of military power that European military tradition had not anticipated. Industrial capacity weaponized through systematic organization and applied with ruthless efficiency to operational requirements. The legacy of American logistics in World War II influenced military thinking for generations. NATO logistics doctrine was built on American models developed during the war. The U.S. military's continued emphasis on logistics as a weapon rather than merely a supporting function derived directly from World War II experience. Modern military planning regarding supply chains, just-in-time delivery, and logistics resilience traces conceptual origins to innovations developed, delivering supplies to Europe in 1944 and 45. Most significantly, the recognition that modern warfare depends as much on industrial capacity and organizational efficiency as battlefield prowess became fundamental to military theory. The American logistics system that delivered 12,000 tons daily and broke the Siegfried Line in weeks demonstrated that in industrial warfare, the nation with the most efficient supply system often defeats the nation with the best army. The story of American logistics in World War II is ultimately not about trucks and tonnage, but about the transformation of warfare itself. For millennia, military power had been measured in soldiers and weapons. The American logistics system demonstrated that modern military power must be measured in industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and the systematic application of resources. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson with devastating clarity, as their defensive positions, despite excellent construction and determined defense, fell to enemies who possessed not superior tactics, but superior supply. The Siegfried Line was breached not by brilliant maneuver or tactical innovation, but by the simple reality that American logistics could sustain offensive operations indefinitely, while German logistics could not sustain adequate defense. In the final analysis, the rapid fall of the Siegfried Line and the subsequent collapse of German resistance in the West resulted from a logistics differential that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. Fortifications meant nothing when defenders lacked ammunition to sustain fire. Defensive terrain meant nothing when attackers possessed fuel for unlimited maneuver. Tactical skill meant nothing when one side enjoyed material superiority of 10-1 sustained indefinitely. The American logistics system that delivered 12,000 tons daily represented more than impressive supply management. It represented the emergence of a new form of national power, where industrial capacity, systematic organization, and logistical efficiency trumped every traditional military virtue. The soldiers who drove those trucks, who loaded those supply dumps, who maintained those vehicles, who coordinated that traffic, proved more valuable to victory than anyone anticipated when the war began. They kept armies moving when traditional logistics would have forced pauses. They delivered ammunition, enabling unlimited fire support. They hauled fuel-sustaining mechanized advances. They moved supplies, feeding soldiers and maintaining equipment. In doing so, they demonstrated that modern military power depends as much on supply sergeants as combat soldiers, that logistics determines operational possibilities, and that the nation which can sustain operations indefinitely defeats the nation which cannot, regardless of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit. The Wehrmacht discovered in the ruins of the Siegfried Line what they should have understood when they challenged American industrial power. Modern warfare is decided not on battlefields alone, but in factories, on highways, in supply dumps, and through the unglamorous but essential work of logistics. The American trucks that rolled through France and Germany carried not just supplies, but proof of a fundamental principle. In industrial warfare, abundance defeats skill, sustainability defeats brilliance, and logistics defeats tactics. The 12,000 tons delivered daily, the weeks required to breach the Siegfried Line, the systematic advance to the Elbe River, all confirmed that the future of warfare belonged not to nations with the best soldiers, but to nations with the most efficient logistics systems. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.